All right, hello. This is the second one of my vlogs. XFAwkward here, and today I'm going to talk about something that one of my viewers was asking about, and he said, "What is scaling?" Right? We hear this term thrown around a whole bunch when talking about a whole bunch of different things in League of Legends, and if you don't know what that is, then you kind of get left out of the loop. And so, the simplest definition I can give for you is scaling is referring to the effectiveness of something over time and as the game progresses, right? So what exactly does that mean? How do we apply that to everything? I'm going to start by talking about items for a second and try to introduce this idea of effectiveness throughout the game and where it's good and where it's not so good. Let's stop and think about the Doran's items. You got like Doran's Blade, you got the Doran's Ring, and the Doran's Shield, right? You buy those and you're going to get a nice little chunk of good early stats that you want. A little bit of health, either a little bit of survivability from Doran's Shield, some damage, some mana regen, something like that. It's good for right there at the beginning of the game, right? We're thinking very beginning of the game, but you don't see people buying Doran's items late game. And why is that? Simply because it's not able to build into anything. It's not going to improve upon itself at all throughout the entire game, right? It's good at the beginning, but it doesn't scale well later on, right? Because it can't get better. It doesn't get better. Whereas you start thinking about items that you build into other things like longswords and the vamp scepters, into bloodthirsters. A bloodthirster is actually a really good example of item scaling because when you buy a bloodthirster, it actually gets better as time goes on. When you get more minions, it's going to give you more lifesteal, it's going to give you more damage. So there's that. Another concept of that is the Rod of Ages is like the epitome of item scaling. You buy it and then it gets better over time. Legitimately, you don't do anything, boom. So now that you got that kind of in your head, think about this in terms of like what abilities scale, right? There's base damages on abilities, right? And then there's multipliers and ratios that affect it based on how much, how many stats you've purchased for your champion, right? And I think a good way I can try to explain like early focused ability scaling would be something like Renekton, right? He does a ton of early damage compared to most champions. However, later on in the game it doesn't do so much. And the reason why that is because his damage ratios are not very high. So if he builds a whole bunch of damage, he's actually going to be vulnerable and he's not going to get a whole lot of return out of that. It's not really worthwhile. That's why you normally see them built tanky instead of damage. But it does its job, which is to be threatening very early and throughout the mid-game so he can transition to a tank later on. Whereas there's other champions that have really, really good scalings in the game with high ratios or something like an uncapped scaling. When you think of like Nasus or Veigar, that their abilities will never reach a point where it can't get better, right? Nasus can continue to farm his Q all game, and the same thing with Veigar, and it'll always get stronger. But those are kind of like the extremes on each end. You've got one that's really, really good, but then will never get better, and then you've got one that's kind of poor at the beginning, but then it gets really, really good as it rolls on. So that's the idea between ability scaling. But let's think about champion scaling, right? You always hear people talking about like which champions scale into the late game, which champions don't scale. And here's something we always hear all the time is Lee Sin falls off late game, right? They say Lee Sin doesn't scale into the late game. And a lot of people don't really know why that is. But let me try to explain for a second. Lee Sin has a very, very strong early game. He's got a lot of early mobility that other champions can't access as quickly as he does. At level 3, he can be jumping around everywhere and can't be stopped. There's not really any other champion that's that good at it than he is. So he's got that going for him. In addition to that, his damage ratios are actually really, really good. In fact, his ultimate's on a 2.0 I think total attack damage ratio, which means it can hit for a ton if you're actually stacking a bunch of damage. But even though he's got all this, why doesn't he scale well into late game? And there's a couple of different factors in that. One, he's kind of, if you try to build him straight damage, then he doesn't have a whole lot of tanky stats. He can't really survive in team fights to really get all that damage off consistently. It's very risky to do that. And if he builds very, very tanky, then all of his abilities and damage, all of his abilities and his damage isn't really high, and he's not very threatening. So in that regard, he's not very scary. So But the number one thing that I think really, really holds him back when you compare him to other champions is the fact that he runs off of an energy source system, right? Because he has to worry about how much energy he's using before he can use his abilities, he's only able to get a couple of rotations of his abilities off, whereas champions that have mana only have to worry about how much mana they have stockpiled for that fight. They can run through as many rotations as their mana will allow, whereas he has no way to really mitigate that. Okay, so that's kind of an example of how Lee Sin's really strong early game, but it will eventually fall off if he doesn't make his impact super, super well known. Now we're going to flip-flop to the opposite end and look for a champion that's kind of weak, but really, really gets going late game. And that, I think the epitome of that is Vayne. As we all know, Vayne is disgusting like 50 minutes in. When she's got 6 items, she's very, very hard to kill, and she can destroy everybody. So it really just kind of shows that like Vayne's early game is very, very fragile. She has to try to survive as best she can in lanes where she can get abused very easily, in hopes that she'll be able to get all the farm that she needs so she can get all of the damage that she needs to survive late game. The big reason why she's very, very good late game is because she's got percentage health true damage that she can dish out very quickly. If you get that attack speed up there coupled with like a Bloodthirster or a Blade of the Rune King, she can be very, very threatening to any target, and there's not really a way to stop her aside from trying to kill her. If you have a team that's surrounding her late game once again, where everyone's got all the items that they want, then Vayne's going to be just very dominant. Okay, so basically that's kind of like very, very opposite ends of the scaling spectrum. You got Lee Sin, who's very, very strong early game but falls off, and then you've got Vayne, who's very, very weak early game but then ramps up extremely hard. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a better idea. But what's very important here is knowing that each champion has an individual rate by which they scale and fall off. Okay, and you need to be figuring out what champions are strong when and when they're weak, because that's going to help you increase your knowledge in each game, and you're going to be able to make better decisions knowing that you're not going to force something where you know that you're weaker or when the enemy's going to be stronger than you, and that's going to lead to you winning more. So I hope this little explanation of scaling helps out. If you guys have any questions that you would like for me to answer, whether it's about this or a new topic or anything like that, please let me know, and thank you for watching. Bye-bye.